technologies, and that was the conference theme. We'll talk about the Aral Sea recovery and also give you some insights into this very rich culture that could possibly benefit from Canadian dirt professionals like myself and others who love nature and love to find solutions. So we have a very rich cultural history. It's one of the most ancient agricultural societies that was formerly nomadic, and till very recently there was still nomadic people. It's a highly continental climate with low precipitation, extreme summer heat, and cold winters, and people regularly talk about it getting above plus 50 Celsius in the summer. So if you're thinking of visiting Uzbekistan, I strongly recommend spring or autumn. Luckily, I was there in the autumn. It's the center of the Silk Road, which now we hear about from our friendly fascist leader of China as the Silk Road enterprise, where they want to bring back these connections. And Uzbekistan at that point, 500 plus years ago, was the center of science in the globe, which is something I really didn't have any appreciation for until I went to Uzbekistan. And being a very flat country, it's had many invasions, which have formed what the culture is. And the most recent substantial invasion was that of I think it was Tsar Peter in the 1800s. And they rolled through Uzbekistan and made major changes. And then, of course, it became a member of the USSR. And in 1991, it received independence. And their first president had some very nice goals about democracy. They came up with a new constitution, but as it was, Islam Karimov was more of a student of the North Korean dictatorship than what we understand democracies to be. And it was, from my interpretation, quite a brutal rule. There was good times for some people, but there was also very unacceptable practices with labor, with not allowing freedom of expression, and much more. And he passed away in 2016, and that led Shavkat Mirziyoyev to become the unelected president. But he's overseen major changes towards democracy and a market economy, and he's proof that maybe you don't have to be elected to be a good leader. And we see what just happened in the United States until the recent election, that quite arguably Donald Trump is a lot worse of a leader than Mirziyoyev is. And just in the last few years, it opened up to tourism. And this picture here on the left, that's in Samarkand, and it's one of the most fantastic pieces of architecture I've ever seen. And this is a madrasa, which is basically an Islamic university from the past. And here's another view. And unlike places like the Taj Mahal, which apparently received much of its inspiration from the Uzbek architecture, this is a busy day in tourist season. And there were a number of tourists from one group of Chinese tour group, and there were no North American people, no obviously European people. I was really the only one. It's absolutely amazing the difference in tourism in Uzbekistan from elsewhere. And you can see the tile mosaics are absolutely exceptional, and these colors are reflected throughout the Muslim world. And if you aren't educated on what you're seeing, which I certainly wasn't, you wouldn't realize that a lot of these decorative tiles are in fact Arabic script. And so these tiles have very deep and powerful meaning to many people. And this is inside the room. This is how students lived 500 years ago in Samarkand. A pretty close recollection of it. And I can't remember what the next photo is, but it was, we'll see actually. Okay, right. So it was, I said to one of the people who was guiding me around that it's interesting how short people were back then, because the doors are about up to now a little bit below my ribs. And he said, well, that's not actually because of how short people used to be, but that's because of the reverence that you need to have to be in these schools, and you need to bow down. And this another part of this tour that was amazing for me is my tour guides were a group of 5 Uzbek surgeons who were friends and related to Bakhtiyor. So I had the region's preeminent surgeons as my tour guides, because Uzbek hospitality is like nothing else I've ever experienced, and very wonderful. This is one of the mosaics in the roof, and you can imagine if you're actually in this room, if you just let your eyes relax at that image, and it literally starts turning around even on a photograph, but in real life, it's difficult to stand up and stare at this image without getting a bit dizzy. And just some more examples of these incredible mosaics. And of course, we can also learn about biodiversity when we look at this kind of artwork. And of course, at that time, Uzbekistan still had major animals like tigers, and there was a lot more native ungulates than there are today. I actually saw footprints of a species of deer in one location, and that was it. And so this is just a couple in candid photography dressed very classically. And you would not know, if you're like me, where people in the country are from. But when you ask a Uzbek national about someone, it's like, oh, they're clearly from this part of the country by the way they dress, similar to in South America by the kind of hats you wear. So very distinctive fashion, very beautiful clothing. And this is a bride in the most incredible wedding gown that I have ever witnessed. That's pure hand woven silk. And apparently, actually, weddings are a major economic challenge in Uzbekistan because they cost so very much in a low wage country. But I had to photograph this girl, and she was actually quite happy to be photographed. So that's a picture of Karimov, and you see many images of him, but being the kind of country it is, everywhere you in Canada, we used to have a lot of pictures of the Queen. Well, in Uzbekistan, in almost every government office you go in, there's a picture of their current president. It's a very different feeling about how you look upon your leaders than we have. And I was told with great authority that Muslim women never want to be photographed, and you should never ask. Well, these ladies saw my camera and sat me down and passed my camera to someone else because they wanted to be photographed. And it was these ladies are from the south of the country, from near where my friend Bakhtiyor is from. He right away, as soon as he saw that picture, he could tell. This is another one of the domes, and you can see there's actually vegetation growing on the roof. So these buildings are very old, they're very expensive to maintain, and absolutely incredible to witness. And this is as you go to a different part of the city, and this is, well, I'm spacing on the word, but basically a grave. It's a, oh gosh, well, we won't worry about the name, but this was someone who obviously had a very conservative taste. And so they chose work that was very reflective of their choices, whereas others, others had very much more elaborate taste. And this fellow here, this is Boyuk Amir, and he is the man who first mapped the constellations of our stars. And I did not have a clue, but this was the version of the telescope that he used. This is a huge structure, and they did not have any optics, and yet he was able to map astronomy to an incredible level of precision in, I believe, the 1400s. A source of very immense pride in the country. So it was fantastic to witness this and many of these other sites. So here now I've moved on to another city. This is Bukhara, and my tour guide here, Samsat, he's also connected to Bakhtiyor's family through the surgeon connection. And Dr. Saeed, he was my connection in this town. He set this gentleman up, and he toured me all through the town. And this is in one of the major markets. So they don't have the likes of Walmart. They have markets like this, which are the center of pride and the center of trade. And this was just by there. I was interested. I never quite got the story of the storks and the culture, but there's many of these features throughout the country. And for the Canadian Indigenous people who take pride in their fry bread, well, the Uzbeks do too. And this lady was making some very nice fry bread in the market. And also in these markets, the level of pride and organization, you see the way people display their products. It was very incredible. Like, for example, the way these apricots are displayed. Everything in the markets is absolutely impeccably organized and they're very clean. And this is in Bukhara, and I don't remember the name of this site, but again, you can see the scriptures, the colors. It's just absolutely fantastic on your eyes. Many, many different colors and tastes in art in different times. Now I'm going to have to apologize. This fellow was one of the rulers of Bukhara, and he was quite a character. I wish I had remember to bring my notes out, but he was one of the leaders, and these pools were very special because I believe it was every day young ladies were brought there for him to take his pick, and they would wait in this pool for him. And yeah, he was the one who was in charge of this architecture, and this site was absolutely fantastic for the architecture. And also in Bukhara, I got a chance to go to a public school, and I guess it's true, they say blondes do have more fun. This girl is of Russian ancestry, but there's quite a few people in Uzbekistan of Russian ancestry. And so it was very interesting to get to go into a school and be led around by kids like this. And this is Samsad's mother. I was invited into their house, and I can't remember the relationship with this little kid, but fantastic colors, and we were fed an absolutely lovely kind of mid-morning meal of fresh fruits, which are part of the culture of Uzbekistan. Is in the autumn, it's the melons and the grapes, and they're much sweeter than I can remember melons tasting in North America, and much more diversity of them. Also had a chance to go to this farm, and at this farm, what they're specializing in is bringing in different genetic stock from all over the world to work on improving the genetics of the cattle in Uzbekistan. So it was pretty interesting to see North American or Western European looking cattle. The ones you see in Uzbekistan tend to have the humps on their back. And in Canada, we have the F-150, but in Uzbekistan, they have the Lada. And this is basically the pickup truck of the country. I thought that was a king-size bed, but it's actually a table which people sit on for dinner, because people traditionally eat sitting down. So that's enough for a whole family to sit around. And you see all kinds of wild things on these cars driving around the country. And this is in one of the markets. The pomegranate is a fruit with new meaning to me. I always thought they were delicious, but they're also an incredible fertility symbol, and they show up throughout the art and through, like, you'll see it in women's clothing. Many dresses will have the patterns of pomegranates, carpets, and it's very good fortune if a lady wants to feed you pomegranates, which I had in one house, which was quite entertaining. And they have an incredible amount of ethnobotany that does not really leave Central Asia. And this is a fellow in the market who is telling me through translation about all the different herbs he has. And a number of these herbs were picked in the wild. So they have very much a wild crafting business of people picking wild plants and harvesting them. Some of them are used for medicine, some for food, and also many are used for smudging as a purification ritual, similar to what we would see in North America with the sweetgrass. So the Aral Sea, in better days, it was the fourth largest inland water body in the world. And it had such a rich fishery that the USSR got about 15% of its fish protein from it. And it's in the UNESCO Memory of World Register as a unique environmental disaster. And I can definitely say I could not imagine a disaster worse than what I witnessed there. And it was triggered by basically Soviet era engineering and agriculture, and they had the goal of producing as much cotton as was humanly possible. And it was called white gold amongst those circles. And they predicted that the Aral Sea would be destroyed. So they consciously knew this in the 1950s and 60s when they were putting up this irrigation. And yes, indeed, science works and the predictions came true. And it triggered absolutely monumental dust storms. These dust storms are believed to be detectable as far away as Norway. And of course, you can imagine locally what these dust storms would do. It's believed that because of all the agricultural residue, these organochlorine pesticides that were used in absolutely crazy amounts, the salt from the Aral Sea, this all became airborne and produced very high levels of toxicity. And these storms were so intense that they greatly affected people's health. They killed herds of livestock. And currently, there's only a little tiny bit of the Aral Sea that is remaining. And this part is only part of the sea now because there's a dam that retains that water. And that's the only part that's fish bearing. So this loss led to very substantial terrestrial biodiversity loss in the area surrounding the Aral Sea due to both local climate change from losing this combined with global climate change. So now the Aral Sea is referred to as the Aral Desert. And that ship was in the water when the Aral Sea dried up. It's absolutely mind-boggling the power of humans for destruction. So that image on our left, that's what the Aral Sea did look like in previous times, and today on the far right, that's what it looks like today. There's only the northern sea has fish. The rest of it's too salty to maintain any kind of life other than brine shrimp. So this is kind of an odd slide without the story. So I was in Tashkent, that's the capital of Uzbekistan. And the evening before, I had an absolutely fantastic dinner with family friends there. And we, of course, being Uzbekistan, you get into the home and they have excellent COVID practices, even pre-COVID. Every home typically has a sink at the front door for all your guests to wash your hands. So I got in there, washed my hands, had a fantastic dinner, drank way too much not so fine vodka. And then I got attacked by a dog. And I had my leg ripped open that evening. And the next morning I knew I had to get up at 5:30 to make it to an airplane. And so I got up and I saw my email and they said they actually wanted us to be at the airport at 4:30 in the morning. So I walked to the hotel anyways nearby where I was supposed to get picked up. And they said, oh no, the bus has left. The bus left an hour ago. And I said, but the plane's not supposed to leave till 8 o'clock. And they said, yes, we know, but the schedule changed. So I got onto my emails furiously and found out that it wasn't too late. So I rushed like crazy on a taxi going over 100 kilometers per hour through Tashkent. Got to this airport and I gave them my passport. There was no directions of where to go in the airport, and of course, very little English. And so I thought, well, we're heading to, I'm forgetting the town's name right now, it'll come back to me. And so I went to that lineup and the lady got my passport, started going through tickets, and luckily she spoke English. No, Michael Keefer. No. She looked and looked, it's like, honestly, here's the proof. And she looked and finally she had an aha moment and she looked up Keefer Michael. And there was Keefer Michael. So I got my ticket and she says, you have to find your tour guide. And this airport is about the size of the old Vancouver airport at the South Terminal. And it was full of people. Finally, I saw these intimidating dressed suit guys who looked kind of like KGB with blue suits and red ties. And I thought, oh, well, maybe. And I saw they had tickets and they went through their stuff. No, no Michael Keefer, but they didn't speak any English, so it was even harder. But luckily, a fellow plant nerd, Christina, was there, and Christina figured out I must be Michael Keefer, and so she helped me, and they got me a new ticket. So then we got loaded onto a Boeing 767, the same plane that you would fly from Vancouver to London, but we were going for what accounted for about a 25-minute flight. And we got on there, and this huge airplane, and there was nobody there. We were starving. And it was just me and this Spaniard fellow near the front of the plane, and we had no clue what was going on. So we became friends. And about half an hour late, the airplane filled up out of the blue, and they got the plane going. And this was our breakfast. A terrible change from the Uzbek food that we all got used to over there. And so we got on the plane, and the plane landed, and they went through our tickets again, or they asked our names, these other KGB like guys, and they said to me and the Spaniard that, oh, we're group one. And we didn't know what it meant. And so we got off the plane, we went into the airport, and they said, no, you got to get on the bus. So I got out of the airport, we ran back to the bus, got on this bus just before it left, and it drove 20 meters to this reception. And somehow, because of my friends, I was in the VIP group. So we got a true traditional Uzbek welcoming, and these are all traditionally dressed Tarakel-pack ladies. And we went in there and got an absolutely fantastic meal, real espresso, and we were just feeling very happy with ourselves. And then we were told that we weren't on the tour buses. In fact, we were getting the VIP helicopter flight. And usually when you fly a helicopter, at least for me, I've lost a couple people I knew on helicopters. I'm a bit nervous, but I was even more nervous because to me, I'd heard the legends about the Russian helicopters and how they never get maintained and they go until they drop. And we figured we were on one of these helicopters. And this was us at the beginning joking about our demise. And it turned out, though, that these helicopters were about 1 month old and they were Airbus helicopters. So we got on these choppers and we started flying over some incredible scenery, some of the most amazing erosional features I've ever seen, like you see in this picture in the highlands. And then these lowlands, this is all failed cotton agriculture, where there is incredibly diverse wetlands that all got converted into cotton, and then of course the water table changed and it was salty, and so everything died. The Aral Sea was an incredibly important flyway, and you can see these birds are all pointing to where the Aral Sea should have been. And similar to what we have in our riparian, they've got very limited stands of cottonwood. It's not quite as large as our black cottonwood. It's a little bit more shrub-like, but it's populous nonetheless and incredibly valuable to wildlife. And so we started seeing these patterns. And this is all very freshly killed. And this, it turned out, as we were flying along, was the beginning of these plantations. And the future of the Aral Sea is actually in reforestation. And this is one of the many sassul species these ones were hand planted. Other places they were seeded. And it was found that if you don't do this to the terrain, so they bring out these plows and they plow vast stretches of land. If you try to plant it in unplowed ground, the ground is just too salty. But the mobile sand, when they plow it, it causes the mobile sands to deposit, and these mobile sands are less salty. And that allows vegetation to establish. And so you get effects like this. This is one of the older plantations we flew over. It's rather successful, and you can see the way the shadows are that it was clearly created by furrows. And the goal is to cover much of the Aral Sea with this kind of shrub steppe type ecosystem. Another demonstration of a site that they're working on. And this is a different species of the sassule in more photogenic state that's growing quite successfully. It's really quite amazing that you can get vegetation to establish in one of the harshest deserts imaginable. And this fellow would have been perfect as a character set in a movie of the USSR. And I slip on his name, but he's the passionate forester who's leading a good part of the Aral Sea reforestation or afforestation project. And doesn't matter how many photos you take of him, everyone's almost as good as this. He's passionate like very few others. And this is an older one of the sassule trees. And it was interesting. Everywhere we went, we were followed by photographers on this part of the trip. Everywhere you went, there was people taking video, taking photographs, because this was an immense publicity event. There was very little wildlife. This was evidence of some kind of a rodent, but it was very scanty wildlife. And yet, not in this picture, but in many spots, this ground is absolutely covered with seashells, indicating what it was not very many years ago. So I don't know how many of you have planted trees, but Uzbek tree planters live rather differently from our tree planters. These guys are, I can't remember how many people lived in each one of these trailers, and they're all soldiers, unlike our hippie style tree planters. And these guys were actually very worried and concerned that I was taking their photos. And I had to get someone fairly senior to tell them that, no, this is okay. You're not in trouble being photographed. And this is my Spanish friend talking about mycorrhiza as part of the solution to fixing it. And you can see there's all kinds of different seeds he has on the side, and both Latin and in this Cyrillic alphabet, which is immensely confusing to me. And that's another confusion in Uzbekistan, is the mix between Latin alphabet and Cyrillic. People who are older than me all learned how to write in Cyrillic. People who are 40 and under learned how to write in the Latin alphabet, and neither can read each other's texts in many cases, which causes some unique chaos. And we can see our forester here looking passionate yet again, explaining to the president about the need for this. And Mirziyoyev is a kind of leader who gets quite engaged, and he went out to the Aral Sea and wrote a bunch of presidential decrees about how they're going to make stuff happen. You don't have to have process like we do in Canada to make things happen. It all lies in the fairly supreme leader. And this is one of the sweetest suites of tractors I've ever seen. And these ones were all freshly cleaned and prepared and organized for show for our event. And they were all provided by the United Nations as part of the UN's contribution to this problem. So part one of the presidential decrees was that it was going too slow. So there was this decree to speed it up and create green cover. So this is kind of the patterns of the tractors. And they have to do this in the middle of winter, because if you do it at any time of year without snow, it's too hot, too dry, and too dusty. So they have these immense groups of tractors out there working together for this stage. So in terms of the afforestation, between 2018 and 2020, they furrowed 1.3 million hectares, which I'm not quite sure what is the equivalent, but it's an absolutely astonishing amount of land. And of that, 1.2 million hectares were seeded with all these different species, and those are all in metric tons. And these seeds are all hand collected by people like the soldiers. And the sassule are all very low growing. They're not really trees to our standards. They're more like shrubs, and they're incredibly important for wildlife. The tree also offers fuel wood, which is one of its greatest curses because it's triggered a lot of deforestation in other areas around there. There are just some more pictures of the sassule and seed. And this conference had a lot of pomp too. These two people here were both getting given some gifts, and there was a lot of very formal pomp, unlike what you'd see at a Canadian conference, which was part of the fun. That is the lighthouse in Moynak. So this lighthouse looked over the Aral Sea, and now it's 30 kilometers from the nearest remnant of the Aral Sea. Town of Moynak used to be a thriving fish town, and it met its end with the end of the Aral Sea. And so there's a little bit of tourism, and now there's this move towards redevelopment and creating a new economy. And I was hanging out with this young Chinese journalist when I was going through here, and she said, this is just like North Korea. And we had this large room filled of over 100 seamstresses, all with the identical hats and vests on, all with their hands in their hearts in unison. And it was absolutely touching and also kind of frightening, just about how different the worker conditions and everything else are. But this factory that was making uniforms offered great hope to these people. And so flying south, we got to see some pretty large herds of feral horses. And horse meat, of course, is quite forbidden amongst many North Americans. If you talk about a delicious meal of horse meat, many people cringe, but in the Uzbek culture, horse meat is one of the more common meats you get offered. You never see pork except in the huge markets where there's a little tiny section for meeting the needs of the non-Muslim people. But so these horses were all probably destined for food. And the next morning of this conference, again, pomp like I've never seen, we had the red carpet treatment again. This carpet was rolled out, and we had, I think there was about 40 of these ladies, all in their traditional dresses, welcoming us. Definitely made you feel welcome, and many of us got photographs taken with them because it was such a sight to behold, these outfits. So that's just one of the diagrams of how people are seeing a vision for the Aral Sea. And being a bit of a foodie, I had to include this picture. Uzbek culture is a culture of bread. And this is a display of just a number of the different traditional breads in Uzbekistan. And there's a lot of tradition about breads, about never wasting them, how you hold the bread, how you eat it. And I adapted very quickly to the traditions of the breads. And also we can see the fall fruits. And part of the ethnobotany of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is it's where apples come from. And these apples don't really depict the biodiversity in apples, but in some of the markets, there's 20 or more varieties of apples, and they're many different shapes. They taste different, and just an absolute joy to feast upon. And this was the first evening. So it was one of the many funny events. There was an absolute chaos where we had to get onto buses, and then we got to the conference hall where they were feeding us, and there was probably about 45 minutes of videography and photographs of us. And we're just like, oh gosh, when's this going to end? And can't these guys just come inside and take photos if they need photos? But of course, when you go inside an average Uzbek home, as soon as the door is locked and your hands are clean, out comes the vodka. Well, at this meeting, we needed the journalists to leave and everyone to wash their hands, and out came the vodka and the wine. And so we had a absolutely fantastic feast that included many different kinds of meats, including, of course, horse meat and many fruits and prodigious amounts of hard alcohol and wine. Some of it was quite nice and other was quite rough. And we also had the dancers were back, and they were going around this room doing all kinds of fantastic dances and showing off their incredible regalia, which was quite fantastic. And so after this conference, my friend Christina Todorek, she's a professor, and she asked if I'd like to go out on a tour with a group from Germany. I cannot remember the name of the program. And so we got to go on a road trip, and this was one of the sites. Again, an older version of the Lada, I believe, carrying an immense load of fiber. And unlike North America, fiber for the herbivores is of very high value, and people work very hard to collect it, and there's very little mechanization. So the farms do not typically have modern tractors, balers, and nor do they have the right kind of technology we would see in a convenient industrial agriculture model. So you see a lot of this all throughout the countryside, and donkeys remain an important part of the transportation network in the farming areas. And all throughout the country in the rural areas, you see donkeys on the road, and this one was working especially hard. And this lad, I got to carry a camel going down the highway. And we can also see that the technology's changing quick, but this is, of course, a steam engine for the sign for railroad tracks, which I couldn't help but be charmed by. And this is Christina talking about some of the native plants, and she is a fantastic wealth of knowledge. She's a published author on range agrology, the native plants of the area, and she's working hard to help women in Uzbekistan in rural areas be empowered. And if it weren't for COVID, I would have been on a trip in 2020 autumn going from Mongolia to Uzbekistan, interviewing tribal pastoral people on their ethnobotany. One of the great personal tragedies from me of the COVID era was missing out on this, but we're still working at it. So maybe 2022, when Botany BC's back, there can be some adventures like this. The tamarisk, this is interesting how some plants are absolutely horrible in one place, like in North America. Tamarisk is a major threat to biodiversity in the riparian areas of desert ecosystems. Well, Christina explained to me in Uzbekistan, tamarisk is threatened, and that the ecosystem depends on tamarisk. It's very important for pollinators, for browse, and it's almost gone. So this picture was more important than I thought of the tamarisk, and that's the Amu Darya River that used to be a much larger river. It's still a beautiful river, but I can only imagine what it once was. And just across the water from us here is Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan is a fantastic dictatorship. You're allowed to have any color of car that you want as long as it's white. And if your car is not white, you go to jail because the president loves white cars. And they also have absolutely zero incidents of COVID-19 officially in Turkmenistan. And it's almost impossible to go to Turkmenistan. And Uzbekistan wasn't that different until recently. So this bird, I don't know what species, I think it's probably in the thrush family, but I called this the temple bird because we were going to these Zoroastrian ruins, and every one of these ruins, this bird was there to be photographed. So I thought it was kind of like one of the birds in Tolkien, where there was, I think it was a temple bird that communicated with people. And so there's these incredible ancient ruins that I can't even think of the date, but they're definitely 2,000 plus years old, and they're built out of generally adobe bricks. And you just wonder when you look at this, you know, why would have there been this town here? There is a canal right here, but the Amu Darya River is 50 kilometers away. But it turned out the answer is this country, in this part of the country, is so incredibly flat that until the rivers were diked and held back, that the rivers could migrate greater than 50 kilometers. And so this fortification was once at the edge of a riparian area, and now it's hot, dry desert. And part of the reason the Amu Darya River no longer moves, of course, is the cotton pickers. And I met some tourists, and they told me that their tour guides forbid them to even take pictures of them. But luckily for me, my friends were able to organize a different tour for me, and I paid $40 US, and I had my own driver with his grandfather. The grandfather was a driver, and the grandson, who was about 14 and spoke pidgin kind of English, was my tour guide. And so we got to walk amongst the cotton pickers, and we talked to them. And until about 2 years before I was there was forced labor in Uzbekistan. So many of the cotton pickers were school-aged children. University students were taken out of school and made to go pick cotton. But these ladies reported to me that they were all paid fairly. And most definitely the era of forced labor is over in Uzbekistan, from what I was told. And I believe that it was kind of neat seeing cotton. I'd never been close to cotton plants, and really how close the cotton looks to cotton balls when you see it growing on these plants. So it requires very little processing to make cotton balls, you'd think, but I think it's actually not the case. Our cotton balls are probably heavily processed. And that was one of my favorite pictures from the trip. I don't usually take great pictures of people, but I quite like this one. This lady was, again, quite happy to be photographed, so I was quite fortunate. And on our road trip, we were going through this very rural area, and there's this group of women on the side of the highway, and they're all waving their hands and waving us to stop. And so we stopped, and just out of the goodness of their heart, as part of their tradition, they were giving away their version of fry bread. So we had a little fry bread factory happening there. There was one ladies rolling it, other ladies cutting it, others frying it, and every driver that drove by was hauled over and given this bread. And it just spoke to me about the hospitality and the sense of who the people are, and makes me want to go back. And this was some friends I met while we were on a taxi ride. I lost my casual jacket, so I ended up wearing a sports jacket for much of my trip in Uzbekistan. And these two, they didn't speak any English, but they had friends and family who did. And you see, they have taxis that are just, anyone can be a taxi in Uzbekistan. And there's very little public transit. So you go to these car stations, and people show up in their cars, and they ask you where you're going. You negotiate the price, and you get in this cramped cars with people you've never met before, and you drive through the country. And the lady especially, she had relations throughout the country who spoke English, so she was phoning them all and getting me to talk to them on her cell phone. And it was just incredibly interesting sharing their perspectives like this. So this is another of these ancient ruins, and if it weren't for the incredibly dry climate, they'd all have been turned to mud a long time ago and gone. Incredible fortifications, and there's quite a number of these kind of ruins. And around them, if you've got the eye for archaeology, there's artifacts everywhere you look, which of course to look at and not take. And this is one of the sites. It's a traditional yurt, and part of the tour I got to have a meal inside this yurt with, again, traditional foods, and it was delicious and a very fun experience. I think this site's called Ayukala, and this one you can actually stay in the yurts as part of it, but I'd already booked to stay in a different town. Now we've arrived at Hiva, and this is in the southern and western part of the country, and Hiva is extremely different. The architecture is quite different. The three major towns I went to were former centers of empires. So Samarkand was one group, and I think they speak the Uzbek language. I could be wrong. If Bakhtiyor was here, he could correct me, which he maybe is. And then Bukhara, the people there speak a Persian language, and Hiva, it's a different Turkic language that's makes for a challenging country in terms of languages. And Hiva is one of my favorites because of the soft colors. And because the geography, instead of being able to build the, I still can't remember the word for the sites for burial, but Hiva has a very shallow water table, so they have to bury people above ground. It's very shallow and very salty water table, and that's one of the many curses in Uzbekistan is the groundwater is salty. And so for human health, people living rurally, they have an extremely short life expectancy due to the salty water. And that's one of the things that technology can cure through reverse osmosis. And I couldn't help but go into the carpet stores. And this one, it's actually from Azerbaijan, and this ended up in my house. I ended up buying about 8 carpets for myself and friends and sending them back, which some people advise me not to, that you really can't trust it. But handmade carpet that's about 60 years old. I think this was about a $350 or $400 carpet. And the lady who sold them knew all the stories and all the symbolism, which I am not smart enough to remember, but they're generally, these carpets are deeply culturally symbolic, and they all tell a story just like the script. And I always thought wonton soup was unique to China, but Uzbekistan has their own version. But being Islamic, this one is a wonton-like soup but made with lamb. And it was very greasy and delicious. And that's one of the themes of Uzbek food, is it's probably not good for your heart because there's a lot of animal fats. And they say that the traditional diet was very suitable for hardworking agrarian people, but now many people are sedentary. There's a lot of health effects due to this diet. And here's a tandoor oven. This is how the breads are baked to this day. In the rural areas, they still use charcoal, which of course has lots of implications to deforestation, but in the cities, they're all powered by gas. And you can see how the straw sticking out. These are made of adobe, just a mix of clay, mud, and straw. This is one of the towers in Keefer where you can actually walk up a spiral staircase right to the top, and it's absolutely fantastic views. And for those who don't like confined spaces, I don't recommend this site, especially if you're 6'4". And that's the tower at night. Again, you can see the colors in Keefer. There's still, you see the blues and you can see the scripts, but it's much more subtle and incredibly beautiful as well. And there's a bit of modern culture too. I wasn't really aware that Halloween was celebrated. This is actually a very liberated lady. Until recently at the hookah bars, women were not allowed to perform this job. And until that year, it was actually illegal to dress up for Halloween. So here we have a lady whose job is to pass around the charcoal, to take care of people's shisha pipes. It was, again, an interesting experience, the shisha pipe. And this is kind of getting towards the end. And this is inside Tashkent. They have one of the world's most fantastic subway systems that if you ever go to Uzbekistan, you absolutely have to go spend a day on the subway. And it costs under $1 to spend a day underground and going to different parts of the city. And it's how you really want to get around. And so every one of these stations is different. And until, I think it was 3 years ago, it was illegal to photograph inside these sites. So you can just imagine how this kind of architecture would have tantalized people and not to be allowed to photograph it. And there was even a taste of Canada. These are the premium chicken wieners, but to me, I found the chicken sausages were definitely a very poor replacement for pork breakfast sausages in Canada, for me to be a bit ethnocentric. But yeah, there was advertisements for these hot dogs all over the place in the subways. You can see another one. This is completely different architectural style. It's a shame that one's a bit blurry, but very neat artwork. It's kind of modeled after the subways in Moscow. And so I really look forward to going back to Uzbekistan and Central Asia. And I see there's a really fantastic future for these two very different countries of ours to work together in research, education, business, tourism, and of course, friendship. And so that is the end of my presentation. I'd be very happy to answer a few questions.